Just Imagine, a new podcast series by Imagine Theatre. For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Hello, my name is Martin Ballard. Welcome to the very first of a brand new series of podcasts from Imagine Theatre, one of the UK's biggest producer of pantomime and children's theatre. Now, we've called this brand new series Just Imagine because in each and every episode you'll go behind the scenes at Imagine Theatre. You'll meet the people who make the company tick and some of the stars who appear in Imagine Theatre's shows. So just imagine what it's like to run a company producing dozens of shows across the UK, hiring out countless sets, props, costumes and special effects. Just imagine what it's like to work for the company as a lighting designer, a stage manager perhaps, a wardrobe or costume designer, director or performer. And just imagine what COVID-19 has meant to a company like Imagine Theatre and the hundreds of people who work for them each and every year. Well, there's no better way to start the series than with the man who is Imagine Theatre. He's been with the company in all its incarnations since its days as Telltale in the 1990s. He is Imagine Theatre's managing director, Steve Boden. Steve, how are you, first of all?
Oh, hello, Martin. How great to catch up. I'm well, thank you. We've made it through to March, and it's been a year, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about, but I'm really well, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've seen each other, so I can't even remember what you look like.
Do you know what? My hair is round my waist. I look like I've been kind of going around the garden, sort of a bit feral. But no, we're good. We're really well. And it's just, wow, yeah, what a year it's been.
I can honestly say that my hair is not round my waist, but there you go. Let's start at the very beginning. I said you've been with the company since its outset, really, in the 1990s. How did you come to get involved in the first place?
It's a really interesting story. My love of theatre, I can remember going to see a pantomime at Coventry Theatre, probably when I was about 4 years old. And it was Emu in Pantoland. So it was Rod Hull and Emu and Billy Dainty. And it was a kind of compilation panto. And I was just completely hooked in the whole spectacle and scale of it all. And then shortly after that, we'd always go over to the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry and see the pantomimes there. You know, it was the time when Coventry had both theatres operating at Christmas. And in the mid to late 90s, Ian Lachlan started to create the pantomimes at the Belgrade. And I was getting into my teens, and we'd still go every year. And I just loved it. The whole family did. We'd go with a group of family and friends. And the colour and the spectacle and the energy that came off the stage was unlike anything that you'd experience in any other type of theatre. And growing up, I joined a local amateur theatre company in Kenilworth and just instantly fell in love with the whole creative element of putting shows on. I knew I wasn't a great actor, although I loved performance and I loved performing, but I knew that I wasn't great at that. But what really interested me was the whole way that shows were put on, from the lighting and the sound and stage management to designing scenery, building scenery, painting, costuming. My eyes were open to that. And so in the late 1980s, early 1990s, while Ian Lachlan was creating the Panthers at the Belgrade, we sort of had an outing every year to see these shows and struck up a conversation with him. And he was always fascinated by what we were doing as an amateur theatre company in Kenilworth. And I started to write panto for the Priory Theatre in Kenilworth in about 1992 because they weren't doing Christmas shows. And I just thought it was a great way of providing Christmas entertainment and potentially a good way of raising funds for the theatre. And Ian was incredibly supportive of everything that we did. And, you know, as the 90s progressed and I went to university and trained to be a teacher and kept my hand in theatre as a way of having a kind of hobby and something that I really wanted to do as a career but wasn't quite sure how to. Eventually, at the end of my training, Ian said, look, I'm taking a show out on the road. It's called Fun Song Factory. Would you like to come and be a tour manager and kind of look after that and see how it goes? And I just, you know, it was a very much right place, right time, but from an ongoing dialogue over the years.
And of course, those legendary Belgrade pantos with Ian and Will Brent and others became effectively the format of Telltale Theatre in the early pantos days, didn't it?
It did. You know what, we very quickly clocked, and I think, you know, we were all looking at the marketplace of panto in those early days and realised that the offering that was being created at the Belgrade wasn't really being replicated across the country. There were other repertory theatres who were funded to put Christmas shows on who had a similar sort of format, but the vast majority of panto in those days were very much just variety shows. There was nobody who was actually injecting any story into it, and there was a place for those sort of spectacles that the big theatres were running, but from a narrative point of view and from a kind of like a cohesive theatre event, no other producers at that time were really delivering that sort of production. And because we were creating new sets, new costumes, new script, new story at the Belgrade, and then actually they were going into a skip, it felt that they should be exploited elsewhere. We should be taking these shows and letting the rest of the country see what a Belgrade theatre panto was like.
And of course, Ian and Will set up a company effectively to do that, but also they were involved already in lots of children's television productions as well, creators of all sorts of things. Tweeny's perhaps the most famous. So at one point, they really had to make a decision, didn't they, on which way to go?
That's right. It became apparent that the TV side of the company was really, really growing and that the theatre side was growing. And it was a case of trying to manage both operations. And Ian and Will stopped doing the Belgrade Panto in 1999, 2000. That was the kind of final year of that first wave of pantos. And their TV arm really took off. And as time went by, their focus was on that. And so the opportunity came up for Sarah and I to take over the running of the company. And we did that in the early 2000s when Telltale was purchased by a company called Entertainment Rights, who were very keen on exploiting the TV arm of that company. And so we rebranded as Wish Theatre. Sarah came on board just after the birth of our daughter as a kind of like business manager. And Ian and Will kept an arm in. They were very keen to keep an involvement in the creative writing, but their time was kind of stretched in other projects, particularly the TV side. So we started to gradually expand the theatre operation. And you have to remember the early days were focused around acquiring sets and costumes and props from the Belgrade Theatre and from Derby Playhouse and from York Theatre Royal. And at first we were making great guns as a hire shop for other producers to come and hire from. But at the same time, these theatres who were hiring were saying, we'd really like to look and explore whether you could help produce our shows in their entirety, because what you are creating on stage is very strong, and it'd be great for the production values of the venue to also aspire to that level of production.
Just a quick word for Sarah. You mentioned Sarah. Sarah's your wife, of course, and your daughter's now a panto performer as well. That shows you how far things have changed since the initial Telltale Theatre back in the 1990s. But, what's it like at home for the two of you? Because your life 24/7 is panto, isn't it?
A lot of people who come and meet us when we're not at work say it's like living a panto. It is. And I'm incredibly fortunate to have such a wonderful partner as Sarah, because people say, gosh, how does it work? And I have to say, we're just incredibly lucky. Sarah's background is very much in senior business management. She understands the processes that have to be put in place to make a business successfully run. My background is very much creative. It's very much in, aspiring to put something different onto a stage and how we can achieve that, and bringing together groups of people to deliver spectacular productions. But for a commercial operation, those two worlds absolutely have to be synced together. And of course, we have some great heated debates about how we move the company forward. And what's been, I think, the hardest thing is trying to discipline ourselves so that we don't bring our work home. It's been harder in COVID, of course, because we've been working a lot from home. But we say, we leave work at the office when we close the doors. Apart from, obviously, as it gets towards the panto season, when Holly's in rehearsal for pantomime. She's been very fortunate to be able to be a part of the Belgrade Theatre pantos over the last few years. And then we become panto parents outside of our day job. But, I'm sure there are plenty of couples who've tried to work together and who just couldn't do it. And I do feel blessed that we are able to work together and support each other at work as well as at home.
So just to summarise, Sarah does all the work, you have all the fun, is what you're saying.
That's exactly how she would put it. You've absolutely read the line. And I'm sure, part of me does feel like maybe it is like that. Being in a creative industry is unlike any other kind of work. You're doing your hobby. You have to be immersed in it. You have to love performing arts and theatre, and particularly pantomime, if you're going to be absorbed in that as a career, because it is all-consuming, and especially when you are being creative.
Let's just go back to the beginning again, because the growth of the company is just incredible. I think it's something like 14 pantos, as well as other children's theatre shows and stuff that you do during the year now. Correct me if I'm wrong, because my memory's not brilliant. It all started for you really in Boston, didn't it?
It did. Boston, Lincolnshire was the first commission, the Blackfriars Arts Centre. That was the first commission that we got to actually deliver the entire pantomime solution. And that was probably about 2002. It was the year Sarah and I got married. It was a really, really exciting time for the company because until then, as I'd said, we'd been hiring scenery and costumes to various buildings. But this was the first time that a theatre had said, look, we want you to deliver the entire production. It was Dick Whittington, which is one of my most favourite pantomime titles. So we got the Ian and Will script that we'd done at the Belgrade a few years earlier. Ian and Will rewrote it. We cast a brand new cast of performers that were new to me, but some of which had appeared in the Belgrade Theatre before. And off we went to deliver this first pantomime. I remember it as though it was just last year. I remember driving over to Boston. It's an incredibly long journey, although as the crow flies, it's not very far. But to get to Lincolnshire, you drive down a lot of very flat, long, straight roads, and it took 2.5 hours. We arrived there and we were staying in a guest house. And that sense of kind of climbing into bed the night before rehearsal started going, goodness, we're going to start to create our very first pantomime for Telltale Theatre Productions, was a moment that, I will hold on to and cherish, because little did we know at that stage what the company was going to become. And I always look back on that and think, goodness, at the time, had I known where we were going to go, would I have carried on doing what we were doing? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And that's what's been exciting, going on an adventure, not quite knowing what the outcome's going to be, and with no preconceived ideas, but just, letting the company evolve and letting the business evolve and using the great skill that we were fortunate to be able to employ in those early days.
Tell us about that growth, because I mentioned something like 14 or so venues this coming Christmas, hopefully, fingers crossed. How do you get from, one venue in Boston, Lincolnshire, to where you are today?
Well, there's a funny story attached to our Boston production, because I was driving back at the end of the first week of rehearsals back to home in Coventry, and I got in, and it was about 11 o'clock at night. We'd finished on the Saturday, we'd done a full day's rehearsal, we had the Sunday off, and I wanted to get home and catch up with Sarah and see what was going on with, all the hires and everything that we were also sending out. And I got through the door, and Sarah said, have you seen The Stage this week, the Stage newspaper, the industry newspaper? And I said, no, I haven't. She said, there are 2 pantomimes out for tender when they're both local authority venues. We should start to fill these in. And I went, what on earth's a tender? Of course, Sarah knew what they were, because her previous background had been in, super large organisations like Marconi, where tendering for contracts was part of the norm. You just, it was a local authority contract and you had to put a big pitch in. So I said, wow, that looks great. So she said, well, I've downloaded when she said downloaded, I think you actually had to send off for all the information packs at the time. And she had the 2 documents that had come from Loughborough Town Hall in Loughborough and from the Palace Theatre in Kilmarnock, both of whom were looking for producers to put a pitch in to do their pantomimes. So literally, she handed me these documents, and I remember kind of going to bed with the Loughborough one to read, getting up for breakfast on the Sunday morning and reading the Kilmarnock one, and then Sarah saying, right, we really need to submit these and fill them in because they need to be in, and the minute you get back from Boston, the deadline will have passed. And we spent that day off filling in tenders. I'd never filled one in, and Sarah and I went through them, pulling a huge amount of information together to put a bid in for how we thought the pantomimes at both Kilmarnock and Loughborough could look the following Christmas. Off I went back to Boston. Sarah duly completed them, put them in the post and sent them back to those authorities. And literally a couple of weeks later, we got interviews for both projects. And I remember having a very long conversation with the team at Loughborough Town Hall, and then actually going up to Kilmarnock as well to talk to Janice and the team up there and watch the shows that they had that Christmas. And then at the end of the panto season, when Boston closed, we were driving out to watch a pantomime at the Mercury Theatre in Colchester after our season at Boston had finished. And the phone went, and it was Loughborough Town Hall saying, we loved your pitch, we loved the chat that we had with you, we'd really like you to put the pantomime on for us. And it was like, goodness, thank you. And then we went to the show at Mercury Theatre, watched that panto, were driving home and took a phone call from Kilmarnock, who've said exactly the same. We've really enjoyed your pitch. What you're doing is great. It's very fresh. It's very different. We'd really like to work with you on pantomime this year. And in the space of that kind of one project at Boston, we'd acquired another 2 contracts on top of the one that we did at the Blackfriars Art Centre. So
not bad at all. First 2 tenders and you get both jobs.
From then onwards, it was a real kind of the start of the development of our producing arm, as well as being a hire operation.
So the growth has been incredible, and you've worked with thousands and thousands of people now, performers, backstage crews, directors and so on, at various venues up and down the country, in Wales, in Scotland, in England. And then all of a sudden the wheels come off, because for so many producers and theatres, COVID-19, we didn't really know what to expect when the first news broke on what it was, but it's been a devastating 12 months, hasn't it?
It really has. As I've said, you have certain memories of your career that you remember most vividly. And I remember calling the entire team into a meeting at work, and Sarah and I sat them down, and I very rarely write notes and prep what I'm going to say in a meeting, because I like it to be quite a meeting where meetings kind of evolve as they go. But I'd done a lot of homework on this one, because I remember sitting the team down and saying, look, we know there's something happening, and we know what is happening is pretty serious. We think there is a likelihood that it will have a massive impact on our sector, and we think it's even more likely that it will affect the pantomime industry particularly. We don't know to what extent, but we need to be prepared to work from home and react to whatever situation is thrown at us. And it felt like I was delivering a speech from a real kind of epic 1970s disaster movie. And everybody was looking at me, and Sarah had already spoken to our IT department and said we need to get everybody able to work from home. And of course, that was before people had really realized the likelihood that was going to be the case. We literally came out of that meeting, and within the week, we were all working from home, faced with the complete closure of our sector. There was, absolutely no theatre. It wasn't like the supermarkets or some of the shops that were still open and trading, although under a much tighter set of rules. There was no theatre. And of course, when there's no theatre, it's very difficult to plan. It's very difficult to work out whether you're going to be able to keep your staff in employment, and the pressure that brings. It's just really weird. It's like everything goes in slow motion, and you have extracted yourself from it. And you're watching this journey take place, but you're not quite sure what that journey is going to entail. Most strange. And of course, it has been devastating for our sector.
In terms of the year that's gone, you've obviously been able to sort of come up with contingency plans for whatever scenario, but you've had no income. You've not been able to stage anything at all. How devastating has that been to the company and its staff financially?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's been really difficult. Sarah and I really struggled at the start of lockdown in the middle of last March. We weren't very well. I think it was all of the kind of panto season, stress that you always get, and you always kind of wind down from that and inevitably feel quite poorly. But we kind of had suppressed that because we were going into this kind of period of unknown, and everything that was going on was causing us to be focused on survival. Anyway, as we started to work from home, we both became really, really poorly. And we think we got COVID. We think we had it, and we were wiped out, the pair of us, for a good week and a half to 2 weeks. And at the end of that, I remember Sarah saying, look, we actually have to now take control of this situation because nothing else is going to. Let us project the worst possible outcome we can think. And she said, what's the worst possible outcome of all of this? And I said, well, to be honest, that we don't get a pantomime season, and actually we have no income for the year. And she said, right, let's work through on the basis that we have to survive until 2021 without any income. And let's plan the company, plan the accounting, plan the finances, plan the business to work on that basis. And from that point, once we'd taken control of the situation and said, right, how does the company get from A to B with no money? We felt that we were back in control. Of course, what we hadn't realised kind of in the spring of last year was quite how devastating it was going to be, and the impact that it would have on our staff and ourselves, and the fact that us and our fellows across the whole country in theatre were going to be making staff redundant. We're going to have to be completely changing the terms of contracts and the way we work with people, and look to all the support that was laid out. And of course, there was support. There was support laid out in the shape of furlough, which was invaluable for us. There was the Cultural Recovery Fund that was invaluable. But what was becoming apparent throughout the year, that the bulk of people that we were working with, the freelancers, were not able to access this funding. And we were reading and hearing from our colleagues, and there were some really, really difficult situations that people were in. And you kind of questioned, gosh, there is an enormous amount of financial help being offered up here. How come it's not reaching the people that need it? And so we were desperate to try and give any work that we could to the freelancers and the people that had been loyal to us over the years, whilst having to make some really tough decisions as well with staff who had been working with us for years, and perhaps, and ultimately having to consider making them redundant for the survival of the business, for us to be able to re-employ them when we finally got out of this situation. And those were the hardest decisions that Sarah and I have ever had to make.
A quick reminder that you're listening to the first in a series of podcasts from Imagine Theatre called Just Imagine. I'm talking today to Managing Director of Imagine Theatre, Steve Boden. And 12 months on, Steve, since the closure of theatres, are you more optimistic now?
Do you know, I think I am so much more optimistic. And I have to say, it's only been in the last 2.5 to 3 weeks that I felt the optimism level in our sector, in fact, our industry, really start to lift. I think we came out of the Christmas season this year, which with obviously no pantomimes really being staged. There were a few that managed to make it around some of the restrictions before everybody was pushed into lockdown. And those months in January and February were really dark for everybody in our industry, because I think we all felt that we were actually 2 or 3 steps further back than we had been in the worst of it in 2020. It was cold, it was winter, it was dark, and of course looking back on it you go, well, of course everybody was going to feel pretty depressed about the conditions that we were seeing, and it was very, very tough out there. There was no sign of when theatre would ever be able to reopen again, and producers who had attempted to put product on last year had obviously been proverbially burnt, as it were, and had lost a lot of money. And nobody was prepared to take any risk. No theatres were prepared to reopen without any product out there. And it was very bleak. And then we got some words from the Prime Minister 3 weeks ago that suggested that actually, despite everybody's opinion, there was a plan. Nobody knew whether that plan was actually going to be able to be rolled out, but at least there was a framework that we could all listen to and go, okay, I understand the logic behind it, even if I'm not convinced that those dates are going to be attainable. And that, within a matter of days, once people had computed what had been said, a couple of weeks ago on that Monday press announcement by the Prime Minister, people started to think, okay, all right, we can see a route through this. There were some producers who were obviously putting big shows on in London who were saying, okay, well, let's see if we can get those back on. And then a number of regional producers were saying, all right, well, perhaps we can put a tour out in the autumn. Perhaps we can get the industry back on its feet. And gradually, over the last few weeks, there has been very positive and very constructive conversations with all of our venues and across the sector in how we can get shows on again. You have to also remember that we're still in a pandemic, and a serious one at that. And unfortunately, the work that we do takes place over the winter periods. Pantomime is synonymous with Christmas, with cold, dark nights. And there is a potential that we may yet encounter some more disruption next Christmas. But what I sense is that all the planning that we're able to do now will pay dividends as the year progresses and we work out how we can get pantos back into theatre this Christmas.
I think audiences might be thinking, well, it's 9 months away, surely it'll be okay, but they have to understand how you work throughout the year as well, don't they? So by this time you'd probably be finalising some of the early casting. You'd be looking at April or May to do photo shoots with a cast and so on for publicity and all that investment that has to go with that. You have to make key decisions, because there's no point making all of that sort of investment in marketing and everything else and then have the show pulled, because you'll never get that money back.
That's exactly right. And that, I think, is what people who don't work in our industry have kind of really started to understand, that you can't open a theatre and bring shows in. The whole process of putting on productions, particularly pantomimes, for a pantomime like ours, regardless of its scale, it's a 16-month minimum lead time in getting that production on its feet. And even established musicals and plays that are out there and are waiting to get restarted will require many months of preparation in order to bring those shows back together again, in a very different health and safety landscape, with very different customer demands in terms of going to the theatre, and that takes time. And so from Imagine's point of view, we very, very quickly, in our darker moments of January and February, realised that we had to present theatres with support and with a number of scenarios so that we could project forward and say, look, we have a number of different scenarios here that we may find ourselves under towards the end of this year, and we have to come up with a plan that will allow us to be as flexible as we can in delivering a solution so that we can react to demand or safety issues or whatever the virus is doing, and create a show that responds to that, and is obviously one that financially won't bankrupt the company or the theatres, but one that hopefully will allow audiences to go, yep, we want to see that. We want to come and be a part of Christmas pantomime. And we all hope that we'll be able to deliver pantomimes in the way that we always used to, but we cannot rely on that. And therefore, as a business, we have to make sure that we have contingencies in place for every scenario.
Well, fingers crossed for that. I'll tell you, it would have been my, I think, 18th year working for you last Christmas. I didn't know what to do with myself, to be honest. So I'm fingers crossed that we'll be back this year. I'm going to finish with 3 quick questions for you, which in future episodes, we'll ask all of our guests. But also, if you're listening to this and you have any questions for any future guests that we have, then just go to the Imagine Theatre website, drop them an email with a question, and we'll ask the question for you if you have any in the future. But Steve, first thing I want to ask you is, what's your favourite panto title?
And it's a strange one, because I have to say there are titles that are more popular than others, and Dick Whittington goes through phases, and in recent years hasn't been a commercially popular title. Audiences, I think, have perhaps not quite known what the story of Dick Whittington is, and that's fair enough. It's not a Disney movie or anything like that. But the great thing about Dick Whittington for me is that it's set in London, but it's an adventure story, and this adventure story takes you to foreign lands and allows you to explore different cultures. And in Dick Whittington, we sail on a ship across to the east in search of a cure to get rid of the rats that have taken over London. And it's got comedy, it's got adventure, it's got pantomime animals in it. It's bright, it's colourful, and I think it's got all the elements of a great traditional panto.
And it's sentimental as well in terms for you in that very first one in Boston, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's probably that hanging in there, that it was the start of what we've created.
Well, of course, things can go wrong in any show, but in panto, they can be some of the funniest moments, can't they? When was it not all right on the night?
Goodness, we've had a number of moments in our careers. I think everybody has, where you kind of go, goodness, we're in a bit of a pickle here. I think one of my early memories of that was at the first pantomime we did at Loughborough Town Hall, which was an Aladdin, which you were playing Widow Twankey in. And I remember it was late one night, and we were doing a technical rehearsal. That's the rehearsal where obviously we spend the time making sure that all the physical elements of the production, like the scenery and the costumes and the lighting and sound and stage management, are all able to work through their sequences. And we went to set the laundry, and we had a cloth that we were using that said Twankarama. It was the internal workings of Widow Twankey's laundry. And for those of you who work in pantomime, most pantomime sets are framed by what we call portals that frame the set. And Loughborough Town Hall doesn't have as big a stage as the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry, so the portals that we were using had been brought in. But unfortunately, and Kevin Cutts, the technical manager, I remember him rushing into the auditorium when we flew the set in. He was laughing and slightly concerned, and it was late at night and we'd had a heavy day, and he said, "We've got a problem." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "Well, look at the cloth." And rather than seeing Twankarama, the the T at the start and the A at the end were masked. And I won't say what you saw, but most people who are listening will probably be able to work it out. And it was one of those great rehearsals where you actually just stopped. We all had a jolly good laugh. And we said, right, let's pick this up in the morning, and that was the end of the call. But I think that's probably one of my favourite rehearsal moments.
I think, yeah, that's hysterical, and I remember that like it was yesterday. I also remember another funny moment which I didn't hear about, or the cast didn't hear about until after the show. But it was one particular performance at Loughborough Town Hall. I can't even remember which panto it was, but you'd directed, and you'd come in to sit through a school show, just to see, how it was sort of bedding in, because we always started the run with a series of school shows. And if you remember, Steve, I think it was full of scouts, that particular performance.
It absolutely was. There was a lot of parties, and it was a very busy auditorium, yeah.
Do you remember what happened?
I do. Do you want me to tell the story, or do you want to tell the story?
Well, it's your story. I'll tell it if you don't want to.
I think it was Sleeping Beauty, but it might have been Cinderella. Anyway, we were getting towards the kind of like the slapstick scene in Act 1, And this child was obviously desperate to go to the toilet, but then the helper who was taking the child to the toilet looked green, really looked poorly. Anyway, I was standing up near the doors at the rear of the auditorium to let said helper and child out so that they could use the facilities. And as this lady who was taking this child approached me, she must have been really poorly, and she projectile vomited across the back row onto me as I held the door open. And I actually felt that I was a part of your slapstick slosh scene, Martin. I was to the point where I actually had to follow them out, and I had to also go into the bathroom and clear myself up. Fortunately, the front of house staff at Loughborough were fantastic, and they dived straight in and sorted out the customer and the child. But yes, I was showered in some unpleasantness.
Final question then, and this is, again, it's pertinent to everybody involved in Panto. Why is Panto so special to you?
I think it's because families come together. We never take pantomime for granted. We never take any performance for granted. And I always say to the cast, you have to remember that most of the audience that come to see pantomime are coming to the theatre potentially for the first time, particularly if they're young children, but also families who may not be theatre goers for the rest of the year. They want to come and celebrate Christmas. They want to celebrate time together, and they want to have a really great night out. And potentially parents and grandparents remember doing that in their childhood. You know, Panto's been around in the format that we know it for hundreds of years. And that's an enormous responsibility for a producer and for a cast, but it's also incredibly magical because you're making memories. All theatre creates memories, but memories of going to the theatre as a child last with you your entire life. And if we get it right, those people, those youngsters and their parents and grandparents will hopefully come back to the theatre. Even if they don't come back during the year, hopefully they'll come back at the end of the year and see the pantomime again. And those children who've seen it will hopefully in years to come bring their children. And the whole art form develops and evolves as time goes by. And I think that's what got me into it. And I sensed that from a very early age, that it was something magical and special to be with family and friends and to have a really good time at a theatre watching something live. And more so now, I think, because everybody's, particularly in the last year, got so used to talking to other people on a screen or on a headset, and we've lost that social connection. And I don't think we'll ever lose that. There was always a fear that, you know, once people got used to talking on screens, would they ever want to go out again? And I think from a theatre's point of view, we don't need to worry because audiences like shared experiences. People like to come together and enjoy an experience and then be able to go home and talk about that. And I think from a theatre's point of view, as long as we treat the audiences with care this year and we look after them and we reassure them that it is safe to come back to theatre and that we only allow them back when we know it's safe, then I think theatre has a really strong future.
I think you're absolutely right. One thing's for sure, people have said over centuries that old radio's here now, old television's here now, old cinema's here now, VHS tapes or PlayStations or whatever, pantomime will die. Nothing has got in its way so far, and I hope COVID-19 hasn't. We'll keep our fingers crossed that we're all back again next Christmas. Steve, thank you so much for talking to us.
You're welcome.
In the next episode, I'll be talking to the Scottish actor, writer and director who's appeared in Coronation Street and Brookside, amongst many others on television. He's a panto writer, director and a fabulous dame. He is Eric Potts. So make sure you subscribe to Just Imagine, the brand new podcast series from Imagine Theatre with me, Martin Ballard. I'll see you next time, and don't forget you can subscribe right now through your favourite podcast app.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. Don't forget to subscribe to the series, and you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.